There are mountain passes that are simply routes from one valley to another, and then there are passes that become destinations in their own right. Tradouw Pass in the Western Cape belongs firmly in the second category. Connecting the Berrydale area with the Tradouw Valley and the road towards Suurbraak and Swellendam, the pass cuts through the rugged southern slopes of the Langeberg. Today, it forms part of the R324 route and offers motorists a spectacular combination of mountain scenery, engineering history and geology. At around 16 kilometers in length, with an altitude difference of roughly 219 meters, it's not an especially high or intimidating pass. Its attraction lies instead in the dramatic landscape through which the road winds. The name Tradouw comes from the Khoi language and is generally translated as Woman's Path or Footpath of the Woman. Long before the arrival of European road builders, the mountains were already being crossed by the indigenous people. The valleys provided routes through what would otherwise have been a formidable barrier, and some of these ancient pathways influenced the routes that followed centuries later. By the middle of the 19th century, however, the old paths were no longer adequate for the expanding farming economy. Farmers in the Klein Karoo needed a more direct route to the markets around Swellendam and, importantly, to Port Beaufort on the Breede River. At the time, transporting produce by ox wagon was painfully slow, and the alternative routes over or around the mountains added many kilometers to an already arduous journey. There was growing pressure for a proper road through the Tradouw Valley. A proposal was first raised in the 1850s, and eventually the Cape government commissioned one of the colony's most accomplished road engineers to investigate the possibilities. That man was Thomas Bain. Bain was responsible for some of the most remarkable mountain roads ever constructed in the 19th century South Africa. Working with limited equipment, difficult terrain and labor-intensive construction methods, he developed routes that were not only functional but remarkably sympathetic to the landscape. Tradouw Pass was one of his projects. Construction began in 1869 and the road was completed in 1873. Contemporary references sometimes call it Southeast Pass, but the older Tradouw name survived. Imagine the challenge facing Bain and his workforce. There were no bulldozers, excavators or modern drilling equipment, and much of the work had to be done by hand with picks, shovels, hammers and explosives. A road had to be carved into the steep mountainsides, whilst at the same time providing a gradient gentle enough for heavily laden ox wagons. And this is where Bain's engineering genius becomes apparent. Rather than simply forcing a road directly up the mountain, he searched for the natural contours of the landscape. The road follows the valley, bends around the terrain, and uses the natural shape of the mountains to gain height gradually. Retaining walls, drainage structures, and carefully constructed cuttings allowed the road to remain stable whilst minimizing the amount of excavation required. The stonework is particularly important. Bain and his contemporaries became masters of dry stone construction, using locally available rock to support the road formations and stabilize steep slopes. Much of this work was not merely practical, it was also aesthetically pleasing. The structures appear to belong to the mountain rather than having been imposed upon it. Although the road has subsequently been upgraded and modernized, the basic character of Bain's route remains. A major reconstruction in the 20th century transformed the pass into the modern tarred road which is used today, whilst retaining much of its original alignment and character. But Tradouw Pass is not just an engineering attraction. Geologically, it provides an impressive lesson in the forces that shape the Cape Mountains. The Langeberg forms part of the enormous Cape Fold Belt, a mountain system created by intense tectonic forces acting on layers of sedimentary rock hundreds of millions of years ago. The rocks were originally deposited as sediments, including enormous quantities of sand that eventually became sandstone. During the formation of the Cape Fold Belt, these layers were compressed, folded and uplifted, producing the spectacular mountain structures that we see today. Tradouw Pass is particularly interesting because the Langeberg in this region has undergone intense folding. Geological studies describe the area around the Tradouw Pass as being associated with the core of a major fault structure known as the Langeberg megastructure. In places, the rock strata have been folded to an extraordinary degree, giving the mountains their characteristic ridges, cliffs and tilted layers. As you travel through the pass, these geological structures become visible in the mountainsides. The apparently solid mountains are actually enormous sequences of rock layers that have been bent and fractured by forces operating deep within the earth. Water then took over the work of sculpting the landscape. Over countless millions of years, rivers and weathering gradually exploited weaknesses in the rock, cutting valleys and gorges through the mountains. The Buffeljachts River and its tributaries helped create the natural corridor through which the pass now travels. For the modern traveller, the result is a spectacular drive. The road alternates between relatively open sections and narrower mountain scenery, with the rock walls rising dramatically on either side. There are several places where the vegetation opens sufficiently to reveal the valley below, and viewpoints provide opportunities to stop, and the Tradouw Pass remains one of those wonderful South African roads where the journey itself is the attraction. It combines scenery, geology, history and engineering in a single unforgettable drive. A fitting legacy for Thomas Paine and for the generations of travellers who have followed this route through the mountains. At the northern end of the pass, the town of Berrydale owes much of its existence to two things: fertile agricultural land and a route through the mountains. But behind the town's name is the story of one of the Cape's most influential 19th century trading families, the Barrys, and particularly the remarkable Joseph Barry and his nephews. Long before Berrydale existed, the Tradouw Valley was used by Khoisan people and later attracted European farmers searching for fertile soil and reliable water. The farm on which much of the present town now stands, known as Tradouw's Hoek, was granted to Adolf Johannes van Coller in 1832. The valley proved well suited to agriculture, producing fruit, grain and livestock. The great obstacle to the development of the area was the Langeberg itself. The existing route through the mountains was little more than a rough track and was unsuitable for loaded wagons. Farmers wanting to take their produce to markets around Swellendam faced a long and difficult journey. The construction of the Tradouw Pass changed everything. It was against this background that the Barry family became an important force in the region. Joseph Barry was a businessman, farmer, ship owner and politician whose trading enterprise, Barry and Nephews, grew into one of the most powerful commercial operations in the Overberg. The company traded agricultural produce and general merchandise over a wide area, with its influence extending through much of the Southern Cape. The precise reason the village was named Berrydale is not entirely certain. Historical research indicates that the name clearly referred to the Barry family, although accounts differ as to which member was being honoured. John Joseph Barry was a major landowner in Berrydale during the 1880s, whilst other historical sources associate the name with Joseph Barry and his nephews Thomas and John. In 1878, the Van Coller brothers formally subdivided part of their farm for the establishment of a village. A Dutch Reformed church was built at the northern end of the new settlement, and the village grew around the church and the important crossroads created by the route through the Tradouw Pass. The church was completed in 1877, the congregation was formally established in 1880, and Berrydale was officially recognized as a village in 1881. In its early years, Berrydale was little more than a church centre, serving the scattered farming community. Farmers would travel into the village for church services, markets and social occasions. But its position on the route through the mountains gave it an importance that extended well beyond its modest size. The Barry family's commercial influence also helped connect the farming community with much wider markets. Their trading network provided an outlet for agricultural produce and brought goods into the isolated valleys, helping to stimulate the local economy. In this respect, the development of Barrydale was not simply the creation of a village, it was part of a much larger transformation of the agricultural economy of the Overberg and the Little Karoo. The Barry commercial empire eventually declined, and other entrepreneurs took over much of the town's economic activity. Among them was William Sterner, who established a general dealer, hotel, drapery, shoemaking and gunsmithing businesses. Barrydale continued to develop as an agricultural service centre and eventually achieved municipal status in 1921. For visitors travelling through Barrydale today, it's easy to see it simply as a picturesque Little Karoo village, but look a little deeper and the town becomes a reminder of how roads, commerce, agriculture and determined individuals combined to transform an isolated farming community into the thriving settlement we know today.